have it, read.
From this will the Lord thy God gather thee.
No one will be missed. Keep going, read.
And from this will he fetch thee. And the Lord thy...
All right. All praises to the Most High. I had to cut that TV down here on the Sabbath. But we're looking at breeding farms. What history books never told you, written by William. Is that Spivey? Okay. Look at her beautiful hair. In 1808, listen to this. In 1808, America banned the import of slaves from Africa. 1808 now. Now, America banned import of slaves from Africa and the West Indies. West Indies. Now, here's the thing. He kind of got this wrong. When you ban slavery from the West Indies, those islands down there, right? Then you're saying that slaves were being brought from the West Indies, the Caribbeans, to America. Now, that's not true, that slaves had to be imported from the small islands to America, right? We know that's not true. We absolutely know that that is not true. Because those islands cannot provide for the whole northern kingdom. Why would they split up? See, here's the thing. Well, I'm telling you that those slaves were brought from North America down to the islands. It wasn't the other way around, right? The slaves were not taken from the Indies, the West Indies, and the Caribbeans to Africa and to Europe. They didn't need them. Why would they go all the way down there to take slaves back up across the Atlantic when they had slaves in Africa, right? They didn't need slaves in Europe. The Europeans were trying to come over, send their people, the poor people and the sick and the criminals. They were sending them here to help them take the land from the northern kingdom that came over here after the Assyrian captivity. They came over here, the northern kingdom. They was here almost 2,000 years before Columbus even got here. They came together on boats, right? They came together, and I'm pretty sure they didn't get to the Caribbean or whatever, the West Indies, and start splitting up. Oh, okay, you guys go on that island. You know, you go, okay, it's Scar, you go back up, or you go to North America, you go, they didn't start splitting up because first thing, they didn't know what to expect when they got here. So they wouldn't separate and diminish their strength before they got established in this land. Now, so that, to me, that would cancel out the Edomites bringing Northern Kingdom Israelites from the West Indies because they wasn't down there in those kind of numbers where they could help them, or they could bring them to North America. Why would they want to? North America was full of slaves, full of Israelites. It was full of the Northern Kingdom. That's where they came first. That's what I'm trying to help y'all establish. We know what the Bible says, where Jacob said that the Israelites would be in the land of the Americas, in the Azareth. They would be in Azareth. We know they would be found when you see a people, when you wake up and start bringing the people back together, returning the captivity of Israel, you would find these people, your brothers and sisters in these places. Now that was before. Now that would be after us waking up and gathering the nations back together to become one nation. The two nations become one nation. That was after Columbus. You see what I mean? We weren't here. We wasn't going to begin looking for our other brothers and sisters or teaching that we were the Israelites until after the 1800s, right? Until after. We didn't begin to get a voice to read until after 1865, when emancipation of slavery, of the slaves. We didn't begin to read. We weren't allowed to read. So we know that we weren't, Jacob wasn't telling us where we would be for no reason at all. And he was not giving us that information. So in slavery, we would know where our brothers would be. This information was given to us so we could identify our nations after we were freed and after we began to preach the gospel that we are Israelites and, the people who are in the lands where they're Native Americans, calling themselves natives of America. Those native tribes of Israel will be scattered all over the Americas and also all over the world. But especially the Americas is where he wants us to start identifying ourselves so we can preach and teach and gather ourselves from Gentiles to get rid of the Gentile mind and take on the mind of Christ and get our identity back, start gathering our identity back. So we had to preach to the people who had lost their identity during the colonizations, reclassifications, the Reconstruction, and all of that. Crafty counsel. We had to bring our nations back together. But here's the thing. They were scattered before we woke up and started bringing them back together here in this land. In other words, they were taken. That's what forces me to believe that they were taken. Those northern kingdoms, tribes were taken because they weren't scattered by the slave masters, right? They were scattered by the slave masters, but they wasn't brought here from Africa on slave ships. When did they go on slave ships? When they removed them from this land and scattered them all down around the Caribbeans and West Indies. They did not need to take Israelites back to Africa for the prophecy to be fulfilled, right? All Israel was not on slave ship, but all tribes, somebody from all the tribes had to experience slavery on slave ships, and they had to be scattered out. So in order for the northern kingdom tribes to be scattered according to prophecy, they had to be taken from somewhere and taken somewhere else. That's why this don't make sense. What he's saying is that they started importing slaves for what? In the 1800s, they had all the slaves. They didn't need any more slaves. 1800s, they had all the slaves they needed. They had the remnant of Israel was still in this land. And see, here's the thing, what you don't realize, what he don't realize, is that, what was that? Here's the thing you don't realize, is that the colonies did not need a lot of slaves. They had hundreds of slaves. Washington and all of them, the rich people who could afford slaves, had slaves. The rest of the white people who could not afford slaves, they worked for white people, or they claimed land and started their own farms. Most of those people that claimed the land and started their own farms, they used their family for workers, and maybe they had one or two hands, slave hands, right? So you didn't need a bunch of slaves bred to, why were slaves even needed to be bred? Why did you need more slaves? Slaves died, right? The hard work, they worked them to death. And with all, it was, let's see, when you count it up, you get about, out of every 20 years, you get maybe 3 million babies, offsprings from these slaves. That's in slavery. Right now, in this condition, every 20 years, they say they count 2 million black people. So out of over 1,500 years, 1,700 years, us being here in this land, divide that by 20, and then you tack on 2 million black people every 20 years. Now, that comes to maybe 300 and something million or more black people to this land, right? Over 400 years, 500 years. If we were repopulating in slavery 2 million, think about what we were doing out of slavery, right? What did the 10 tribes do here? While, and here's the thing, here's another thing. The colonies didn't need all those slaves. They had they could only colonize in about 300 or 400 years. They only could take little towns, 13 cities, 13 states that they had colonized and called their own territory. They were small states. The states were small, the populations were small where they colonized. Because the people that lived there, they ran out and ran back into the interior of North America, Azareth. They couldn't just grab up 100,000, 1 million people. No, those people backed off of them. When they found out, hey, this is our enemy, look what they're doing, then they backed away from them. They moved away from the colonies. It took the colonies almost 400 years to get enough slaves, enough people, indigenous people moved from here down in the Indies, Brazil, all through South America, the Caribbeans. They repopulated that place. You're not going to tell me that all the Northern Kingdom came here and just split up on their own. No, they didn't do that. Yeah, they fought, but when they came over here, they wasn't fighting. So you tell me when they started fighting. The same way happened with Abraham and Lot. Their people began to fight because it was becoming too crowded. So they stuck together at first. This is me. This is the way I see it from the scriptures that I'm given, and common sense, and the way men moved, and the way the Israelites moved. They came over here together. They stayed together. They had to expand their territory. Some had to move farther out. They had to separate and divide to make room for the people that was being born on this land. They were all out in the West Coast and everything. Just 10 tribes. For 2,000 years. 2 million people every 20 years. So you do the math. We got over 500, 600 million people in North America right now. And you can travel miles going to another city or county and nothing but land. So you can't overpopulate the Americas, North America. What happened is the reason why they needed more people to come here is because there were wars going on. And they were trying to remove these aliens off their land. But it was our curse that we had to fall in the hands of the enemies of ours, because that was our punishment from God for wanting them to be our our neighbors, wanting to be friends with them, wanting to live with them, letting them in our business, trusting our enemies. We were in 7 slaveries for that. Idolatry, worshiping their gods, worshiping them as gods, right? So here's what I'm saying. There were slaves taken back and forth. At a point, maybe they did bring some babies and slaves back to the colonizers in America, because it wasn't an easy thing to get a slave to capture a slave in America. You had to go in what they call Indian territories on all the maps. They had little dots of colonized territory on the coast, on the East Coast, the colonizers had. The rest of this whole country was full of Indians, not Gad and Issachar, the Northern Kingdom. The Northern Kingdom is still here. We became one nation. You don't know if you Judah or whoever. You don't know who you are. How? How do you know? You don't know who you are. We know that Judah was woke up first and began to wake everybody else up. But honestly, can I say that I'm of Judah? No, because Judah was the bow that was bent, and then once we heard the truth, we shot. Once the Northern Kingdom heard the truth and was brought back to the knowledge of who they were, then they started teaching it too. And then you have the mulatto Northern Kingdom, light skin. They started teaching it too. So you have a dark-skinned Israel and you have a light-skinned Israel, right? You have the speckled Israel are the different shades of brown. And when you look at that scripture that says, I'm going into a lot, but I'm trying to cover some things so we can get right on this. When you look at that scripture where it said Ephraim shall be a speckled bird. What it said is that Ephraim gave himself. It's talking about another period. Ephraim gave himself to the nations. Mixed himself with the nations. Ephraim. Right? And so did Judah. Yeah, so did Judah. So did the rest of the Northern Kingdom. They took on Gentile wives, Edomite wives, African wives, right? And they did that on their own. So when it says Ephraim did it, Puerto Rico, Issachar, those nations. And basically everywhere that we're scattered, Esau sowed his seed among us. And then when his seed grew up, they became white supremacists. Why? Because they knew that their offspring would survive better if they had light skin and was sympathetic to white supremacy. That's how you get these light-skinned governing bodies in all the nations where the Israelites are scattered here in America, the dark skin. So you got 2 bodies of people down there. You got 2 states. You got the Edomite states who say they are white and say they have nothing to do. They begin to white out their offspring by making sure they had their offspring and marrying Edomites, people with no melanin, the Edomites. The colonizers. Colonizers turned their gene pool back to Edomites after they planted their offspring in the indigenous people. Then the offspring began to say, we will not, we don't want to be, we don't want this brown skin. It's a curse. So we're gonna make sure we white out our offspring. So you see it happen. That's how you get all. That's how you got all the terror. We call them the terror. Jesus called them the terror in Matthew's 13 and 25. The enemy, while men slept, the enemy came and sowed his seed among the Israelites. The enemy came and sowed his seed and went his way. He left them there. White men, when they impregnated their slaves, they did not take them to the big house. It was unthinkable. They wouldn't have lived a second. And it was illegal for black men to have sex, even look at a white woman. So when did Ephraim give himself to the nations, mingle himself among the nations? When did he do that? Because it was illegal for all them years for a black man. They'd kill you, kill the baby, and maybe kill the woman, delete the woman. If you were found, if a slave was found anywhere near that Edomite woman. This was for 400 years. And after they were emancipated in 1865, it was still illegal. The only time it was illegal is before these people came into government, that it was all right to marry their undesirable white people that they brought over here to actually stake claim in the land as they moved indigenous people from the land. They kept pushing, they kept capturing, they kept doing what they do. You know what they do? They distress you. They cut you off from your resources. Hunt you down, until they get your territory. They move you out of your territory and they take over your territory. They replace you. That's what they do all over the world, all over the country. That's their MO. That's their MO. So when they were bringing so-called white people over here, before they became white people, they were giving them land so they can hold, like they do now. That's what these farmers are doing. They hold down acreage and they pay them not to grow, but actually what they're doing is stopping us from moving out of the ghetto, out of our lands, and moving out and have a better life, growing our own food and everything, starting our own civilization, our own communities. Because why? They need us to participate as worker bees in their empire in order for them to survive, because they do not work. They don't do labor. They need slaves for that. They're not built like that, man, mentally or physically. So this guy says, let's keep reading. Let's see, 23 minutes. It's going to be a minute. The majority of new slaves in America came from slaves, but the majority of new slaves in America came from what Professor Foner called natural increase. One could responsibly ask, why ban slave imports and not slavery itself? I thought this was really good. And why ban slave import and not slavery itself? The answer is because for many of the proponents of the prohibition, including Thomas Jefferson, the reason was not based on humanitarian concerns, but on economics. The South was producing and selling enough slaves internally that the slave trade was reducing the price of the slaves, cutting profit. You see that? You see that? This explains it all, man. This puts it together. You got to read stuff and you got to keep studying your history so you can put this. Nothing changed about these people. It's all about money, man. In 1819, another act was passed allowing U.S. ships to not only patrol its own shores, but the coast of Africa in an attempt to stop slave ships at the source, not for concerns about ending slavery, but my eyes are watering, my glasses are dirty, not in concern of ending slavery, but in protectionism of America, slave owner, for protectionism of America's slave owners. Everything was contingent on the fact that there was a self-sustaining population of about 4 million slaves in America. Just 4 million now. Now remember, 4 million slaves in North America. Just 4 million. Right? Think about that. When they got here, it was over 300 or 400 million black people in North America. For almost 400 years, they could only establish their colonies in little dot spaces on the map. You could barely see them from up north, Canada, down to South Carolina, Florida. You had the French, the English, and the British fighting for all that territory right in there. That's all that's as far as they could go. So you had 3 nations fighting for those 13 colonies. It would be all they could conquer because it was so full of Indians, indigenous people, that they could not even move over in Ohio, Indiana. That was all Indiana, down Kentucky, all down on a little farther the interior coast, Midwest, Mississippi, Georgia was called Florida. This is what they called. This is how they mapped it out on the map. They gave these names to these lands, but they did not fully conquer those lands until until the Civil War. Right? Until the Civil War. That's when the Union became powerful, and that's when all those states united together to fight against the indigenous people of the land. And that's when Gad was overthrown. Gad put up that fight against that Union. Gad was fighting the Union. That's when Gad was taken down, when they began to fight the Union. Don't mean that there was only 3 Northern Kingdom tribes. But the other tribes down south. Gad was more north. Gad was more Midwest and Northern. Right? Because they had a direct fight with the Union. They were in direct fight with the Union Army. Right? And and they pushed Gad for the Apaches, the Blackfoot. They pushed them more in the middle of the country and more westward. They went more westward as the railroads started coming through, going west. Then you had soldiers and stuff to fight along that railroad as they were constructing it. So, but slavery had become self-sustaining. You hear that? Population about 4 million. They didn't need no much more than that because they didn't have no land they didn't have no use for the slaves because they didn't have more land. They need the more land they got, the more slaves, they was expecting to get. But they were self-sufficient. In other words, they were breeding their own slaves. They wasn't bringing them from Africa anymore. They say they was bringing them from the West Indies. That's not true. Maybe you had some breeders down there that would send, had some friends up north when they lost some slaves or somebody needed one, they go get them. Maybe they nobody didn't have none to sell. But they had to start using West Indies slaves. But they were moving them. Remember, they were moving them off this land down there. And if they ran out of slaves, because they couldn't make the whole indigenous people out of slaves because they had treaties and they were fighting them back. They couldn't they couldn't come over here and just conquer this land like that. It took them 400 years. 1492, right? 1452 to 1865. 1452, 1552, 1662, 52, 1752, 1852. It took them almost 400 years, man, to take over the government. Let's say they took over the government. George Washington chopped down the cherry tree in 1770, 89 or 79. Let's say 300 and something years before they took over the government. And then he still couldn't take the land. You know how many wars and fights and scrimmages they had against the Indians when they took the government. So yeah, let's see, where are we at? It said there was a self-sustaining population of about 4 million slaves in America at the time. Southern litigators joined the northern ones in passing both the acts that banned the external slave trade but ignored slavery. So in other words, they were selling their slaves, so you didn't need to go nowhere and get no slaves because you was stealing money from them. They were breeding and selling their own slaves. They were manufacturing their own slaves. So the southern and northern United States, they joined together, and that's when they were able to put us in full-blown slavery. Right? They did a lot of other stuff. They gave us, it was free men. You ever heard of the free men here? The people that were not enslaved? It said about 250,000 families with about 20 million acres of land they were on. Those were reservations. They gave them reservations, took their guns, gave them a shotgun or something like that they can hunt a rabbit or something with, and they provided their other foods, nourishments. They began biological warfare at that time, right? Chemical warfare had already begun with the blankets and stuff. But yeah, okay. So that's what happened. These breeding farms. Most of us are aware that slave owners bred their own slaves to produce more workers, right? We are taught almost nothing about the breeding farms whose function was to produce as many slaves as possible for the sale and distribution throughout the South to meet their needs. Two of the largest breeding farms were located in Richmond, Virginia. You see there? Why didn't it say Kansas or Arizona? Because they hadn't conquered those territories. Just what I told you. Virginia and Maryland East Shore. Two biggest breeding farms. As far as cities I've never lived in, I've spent as much time in Richmond, Virginia as anywhere. I traveled there multiple times a year, often for a few days or a week at a time. Richmond is seriously about most of it. Richmond is serious, is that serious? Yeah, about most of his history. I've visited the Edgar Allan That's what Bishop Edgar Allen here in Indianapolis. The Edgar Allan Poe Museum. He must have been a famous black man. I gotta check that out. Monumental Avenue contains several statues, mostly of Confederate Civil War heroes: Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, J.E.B. Stewart, Robert E. Lee are honored there, as the late African American tennis star Arthur Ashe, who was from Richmond, Indiana. August 2017, Richmond Mayor LeVar Stoney said Richmond would consider the potential removal of the statues, glorifying the legacy of South after issues raised in the nearby conflict and protests involving white supremacy. One major part of Richmond history is barely remembered, hardly spoken of and taught publicly nowhere. So yeah, I just wanted to show you that and try to give you that little brief history, because they didn't really need. That's something I'm adding to my memoir. They didn't really need to bring slaves here when they had 4 million and they had breeding farms here. Why go to Africa or anywhere else to get people that's going to die on the travel on your way to the destination, from one point to another? Why go get there and lose all your, maybe that happened once or twice, but they didn't need that many slaves to do the work. What they needed, depending on how big your farm was, but they needed people to occupy the land for their safety. They needed white people or the other nations, the 83 who had united themselves, joined together, Psalms 83, to make sure they held us in captivity and stole our inheritance and made sure we didn't rise up to take it back and indict them for the crimes they committed against us. So yeah, that's quick history. Fair use, fair use. All praises to the Most High.